Greetings, AP scholars. Here's your APUSH review for Unit 2, and looking at the review sheet from top to bottom here. The Great Awakening, what was it and what were its effects? Well, the Great Awakening is a religious revival in the 1730s and early 1740s, and what it sees here is a reawakening in the Puritan community, and you see division. You see what are called the new lights breaking off from the old lights, or the old light churches. And the feeling here is the old lights are too stuffy, they're too doctrinal, they're too dead. And there you have this leaving these churches, and what's happening here is it's not just a religious divide, but because these churches are what you call established churches, they're tax supported. If you're leaving the Anglican Church in the South, if you're leaving the Puritan Congregationalist churches in the North, you are, in effect, it's an act of political rebellion as well as religious. And the importance here is that you are practicing rebellion, you're practicing independence. This is a springboard for later political independence in 1776. Two of the pastors you should be familiar with are Jonathan Edwards and his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and George Whitefield. George Whitefield is famous for preaching in all of the 13 colonies, and it's been noted in various textbooks that this is really the first national event that's binding Americans together. But this is this religious revival. On one hand, it's emphasizing repentance and emotion and sort of independence from churches that you're in disagreement with, but this religious independence is going to eventually be transformed into political independence very easily. The people argue that Americans are prepped here in their churches for rebellion against England down the road. What was the French and Indian War over? Well, this is a war between the French and the Indians, the Indian allies of the French, and the English. The war is between 1754 and 1763 when the Treaty of Paris ends the war. And the fight is basically over the interior of America, what we would say the Midwest, the Ohio River Valley, the area of what would be sort of western Pennsylvania and Ohio. And the Indians, the Indians are on the French side because during this war, and this is sort of an approximate number, but you have got about 50,000 French and about 2 million English colonists, or colonists in the English colonies, and the Indians are joining the side that's the least threatening to them. And shortly before the peace treaty that ends the war, you have the Battle of Quebec, where the French are defeated. And the French will lose all of their territory in North America. The area that's we'd call Louisiana, or the area west of the Mississippi, will temporarily go to Spain, but Canada is going to go to England, as well as this disputed area in the Ohio River Valley. Some terms here, well, basically the effects of the French and Indian War. You're going to see that England, which has been distracted, England, which has fought repeated wars with France, which has had a civil war in England, where Parliament will unseat the king and will execute Charles I. There's been about a century here of distractions, and at this great distance, America has basically been left alone as a generalization. And you have this period of salutary neglect, where the principle of mercantilism, which says that colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country, the navigation acts, which say the colonies, the English colonies, can only trade with England on English ships. So the Americans are doing what they want. They're trading with the Caribbean. You guys know the triangular trade with Africa and the Caribbean. Americans are doing what they want. Americans are politically ruling themselves. They're religiously worshiping how they want. They're trading with whom they want. And there's sort of this de facto independence, which comes to a stop. This salutary neglect is over. And the Brits in particular, because they've had this great victory, but they have a debt to pay, and they want the colonies to chip in for the maintenance of an army in the Americas, and the Americans don't see any purpose for a standing army in the Americas, and they resent this interference as the Brits begin the crackdown. And this is the crackdown that will lead to the Revolutionary War. The Dominion of New England, this is a term here you should know to describe between 1686 and 1689, this 3-year period. You have under James II in England the sort of think of erasing colonial boundaries. All of the colonies, New Jersey and North, are sort of smushed into one super administrative unit called the Dominion of New England. And what happens here is you have the end of self-government in all these colonies, New Jersey and New York, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. The Church of England is established as the official church, and this whole experiment will end. This very absolutist king who's sort of reviving this idea of divine right, which in a sense died, no pun intended, with the execution of Charles I earlier. Parliament is going to chase James II out. It's a relatively bloodless revolution called the Glorious Revolution. So the significance here in America is you have this 3-year period of authoritarianism, of absolutism, of denial of self-government. And this, of course, this is preceding chronologically the French and Indian War. But this is another one of these the English are interfering with freedoms that the Americans have taken for granted. It's short, but it is a little bit of a foreshadowing, perhaps. Thomas Paine and Common Sense. After Lexington and Concord, these battles, Thomas Paine is going to write this this essay, which is very popular, very broadly read, and he's going to appeal to a number of things. This is a little bit of the catalyst that is going to push Americans off the fence from seeking compromise, seeking conciliation, to seeking outright independence. Some various things that Paine argues in Common Sense. He's going to argue the king's ancestry. You know, this guy's essentially German. He's going to argue to the violence that the English are causing, these battles, loss of life, and why should we, have reconciliation with the English? They'll just sort of sucker punch us later. He appeals to geography. Why should an island govern a continent? He's going to use biblical metaphors and imagery, calling the king a pharaoh. He's going to talk about how tremendous numbers of settlers in the Americas are not even English. What duty do they have towards the king? And, you combine this with John Locke's Enlightenment thought here on Americans, all men being born free and having natural rights, and this is going to push Americans eventually into the Declaration of Independence. Proclamation of 1763. Sorry for a little yo-yo here. This is perhaps the first thing that the English do that makes us angry after the French and Indian War. Is there's this Indian rebellion along the frontier under Pontiac, and the Brits basically are telling us not to cross the Appalachian Mountains, and this is the solution to keep colonists and frontiersmen from bumping into angry Indians. What this does is makes everybody mad. It makes the colonial legislatures unable to sell land and raise money. It makes speculators who are, buying real estate, buying low and selling high, as it were. They can't make money, and the frontiersmen can't get deeds to their land. And this is just flat-out interference in American self-government. The Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, don't confuse these. The massacre takes place in 1770. It's sort of a street brawl here, where a number of Americans are killed are killed after the British fire on a mob that's threatening a British sentry post. The Boston Tea Party happens in 1773, a few years later, and the Tea Party is a protest against a monopoly that the Brits give to the East India Company. What this does is it shuts out some American traders, some American merchants, ship owners, and their crews from the tea trade, and it's seen as one more interference in American self-government and economic sort of self-determination. And the Tea Party is met by the British with what are called the coercive acts by the Brits, or the intolerable acts by the Americans. This shuts down the port of Boston. It shuts down the general court, the legislature of Massachusetts. It shuts down town meetings, and it puts Massachusetts under martial law. And the intolerable acts are in 1774. So after the intolerable acts, you have the First Continental Congress, and you have this this meeting of the colonists to organize political unity and an economic boycott of the Brits. The Enlightenment, another name for this, is the Age of Reason, and John Locke is the English philosopher. You should know him. Any question with the Enlightenment. that men are born free. Men have natural rights. These are inherent. They are nature's God has given them to men. And Jefferson famously calls them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And there's sort of a syllogism here that men are born free with rights that government does not give us. We have those rights as something that we are born with. So where does government come from? We create governments to secure our rights, to protect our rights. And this government is created conditionally. It's voluntarily. It's voluntary. It's provisional. And if such a government does not protect our rights, if it becomes oppressive, and you see a list of all the complaints in the Declaration of Independence, which is essentially a list of some 40-odd complaints the Americans have against the British government, men may change their government. Men have a duty to set up a government which is just. And you see this in the Declaration, which is basically Jefferson cribbing John Locke, which is pretty up front. This is sort of state-of-the-art political philosophy in action. Natural rights. Know the religious, philosophical, political, and civil liberty reasons for the revolution. Religion, you should be able to appeal to talk about the Great Awakening and this idea of religious rebellion sort of fertilizing future political rebellion. Philosophical, you've got the Enlightenment beliefs of natural rights as put forward by John Locke. Politically, you have this idea of no taxation without representation, that colonial governments should decide on taxes in the colonies. And think of Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, coming out of the House of Burgesses and Patrick Henry. And civil liberty are those rights of your person, of your property. The Quartering Act is shoving soldiers into private homes. Writs of assistance are the permission, it's sort of a green light here for the king's customs officials to come search your house and your barn and your warehouse, your property. Admiralty courts or military courts giving you unjust trials, sort of kangaroo courts. Standing armies, very threatening, intimidating, insulting. And then, of course, you have the Boston Massacre. You have blood in the streets of Boston. And you have these battles where lots of Americans are dying at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. Effects of the war on women. Well, women are doing men's duties in the absence of men being on the farm and in the businesses. And you see, for example, Abigail Adams, she's buying property and selling it, and she's signing contracts, and she's hiring people. And Abigail Adams has that famous saying, it's for sort of an early proto-feminist, remember the ladies, she says to John on his way in 1776 to the Second Continental Congress. This idea of Republican motherhood is the idea that women are promoting patriotism at home. They're knitting, socks or clothing, whatever, for soldiers. They're organizing boycotts. They're part of the thing with the knitting is they're doing homespun, so you're not buying British imports. And they're teaching children. They're teaching children patriotism. African Americans, you have African Americans fighting on both sides. Remember Lord Dunmore's proclamation, if you fight with the Brits, you'll get your freedom. You've got the Ethiopian Regiment that's organized by Dunmore in Virginia. And then you have tens of thousands of slaves who see the Brits as liberators. They flee the Americans who are the slaveholders. And then in the Continental Army, you have slaves are being given their freedom if they'll fight with Washington. He's got quite a number of blacks fighting in his army. And the Indians are largely fighting with the Brits. And the Brits are promising the sort of leash to restrain the Americans. And after the Second Treaty of Paris that ends the Revolutionary War, the Brits are going to totally abandon the Indians. They will betray the Indians. So this is sort of the short thumbnail sketch, the drive-by review. Look this stuff over. It will be on the test. So good luck, gang. Signing out.